The sand beneath his feet was stained crimson, not just from today's blood, but from countless battles fought in this very amphitheater. Spartacus, a Thracian warrior turned slave, stood in the center of the arena, his bronze muscles glistening with sweat and gore. The crowd's roar was deafening, but he heard something else: the whispered prayers of his fellow gladiators, the clanking of chains, the cry of freedom that echoed in his warrior's heart. Born in the rugged mountains of Thrace around 111 BC, Spartacus had once been a free man, a tribal warrior who fought with the fierce independence of his people. But Rome's expanding empire had swallowed his homeland, and like so many others, he found himself captured, enslaved, and sold to the gladiatorial schools of Capua. The year was 73 BCE, and Rome was at the height of its power, controlling most of the Mediterranean world through military might and brutal subjugation. The gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua was a prison disguised as a training ground. Here, men from across the empire, Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Africans, were forced to fight and die for the entertainment of Roman citizens. The conditions were horrific: cramped cells, meager rations, constant brutality from their Roman overseers. Death was not just a possibility in the arena, it was almost inevitable. But Spartacus was different. His natural leadership, combined with his military experience and burning hatred of Roman oppression, made him a magnetic figure among the gladiators. He spoke multiple languages, understood Roman military tactics, and possessed an unshakable belief that death was preferable to slavery. As he trained with his gladius and net, he was also planning something unprecedented: a full-scale rebellion against the most powerful empire in the world. The spark that ignited the rebellion came in the spring of 73 BC. Spartacus and his closest allies, Crixus, a fierce Gallic warrior, and Enomas, the German giant, learned that they were to be executed for some minor infraction. Rather than accept their fate, they chose to act. Using kitchen knives and makeshift weapons, they overcame their guards and broke free from the school. In that moment, as they burst through the gates of Capua, they transformed from gladiators into revolutionaries. What happened next defied all Roman expectations. Instead of simply fleeing, Spartacus called upon every slave in the region to join their rebellion. His message was simple but electrifying: "We are not animals to be slaughtered for entertainment. We are men, and we will die as free men, not as slaves." The response was overwhelming. Slaves from plantations, mines, and households flocked to his banner. Within weeks, his force had grown from 70 gladiators to over 10,000 desperate souls seeking freedom. The rebels established their base on Mount Vesuvius, the same volcano that would later destroy Pompeii. The mountain provided natural defenses and allowed them to raid the surrounding countryside for supplies and recruits. Spartacus proved to be not just a charismatic leader but a brilliant military strategist. He organized his diverse army into disciplined units, trained them in Roman military tactics, and established a crude but effective supply system. Rome's initial response was dismissive. The Senate viewed this as a minor slave uprising that could be easily crushed by local militias. They sent Gaius Claudius Glaber with a small force to deal with what they saw as a rabble of runaway slaves. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. When Glaber's forces surrounded the mountain, expecting to starve the rebels into submission, Spartacus demonstrated his tactical genius. Under cover of darkness, the gladiators lowered themselves down the supposedly impassable cliff face using ropes made from vines. They circled around and attacked Glaber's camp from behind, routing the Roman force completely. The victory sent shockwaves through the Roman world. Slaves had not only defeated Roman soldiers, but had done so through superior tactics and coordination. The rebellion's success attracted more followers. Spartacus's army swelled to over 40,000 men, women, and children. They weren't just fighting for freedom. They were creating a mobile society of former slaves who governed themselves, shared resources, and protected their families. For many, this was the first taste of freedom they had ever known. As the rebellion grew, so did the Roman response. The Senate dispatched Praetor Publius Varinius with 2 legions to crush the uprising. But Spartacus had learned from his gladiatorial training. He knew that survival meant constant adaptation and relentless pressure on his enemies. He split his forces, using guerrilla tactics to harass Roman supply lines while avoiding direct confrontation with superior numbers. The rebels' greatest victory came against the forces of Lucius Cosenius. Spartacus's army surprised the Romans at their camp, killing Cosenius and capturing vast amounts of military equipment. Now his slaves were armed with proper Roman weapons and armor, making them even more formidable opponents. The sight of former slaves wearing Roman military gear and fighting with Roman discipline terrified the Roman populace. However, success brought new challenges. As the rebellion grew, disagreements emerged among the leadership. Crixus and many of the Gallic and German slaves wanted to stay in southern Italy, raiding and pillaging Roman territories. But Spartacus had a grander vision. He wanted to lead his people across the Alps to freedom, much as Hannibal had done centuries earlier. He understood that remaining in Italy would eventually lead to their destruction, as Rome would never allow such a rebellion to succeed permanently. The split in leadership proved costly. Crixus broke away with about 30,000 followers, intent on continuing the fight in southern Italy. This division of forces weakened both groups and played into Roman hands. Crixus was eventually defeated and killed by the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, who had been given command of 8 legions to end the rebellion once and for all. Crassus was a different kind of opponent than the rebels had faced before. Wealthy, ruthless, and politically ambitious, he understood that his career depended on crushing Spartacus. He implemented harsh discipline among his own troops, decimating units that showed cowardice, and pursued a strategy of containment rather than direct confrontation. His goal was to trap the rebels and force them into a decisive battle where Roman numerical superiority would prove decisive. The beginning of the end came when Spartacus, realizing that his dream of leading his people to freedom across the Alps was becoming impossible, made a desperate decision. He attempted to negotiate with Cilician pirates to transport his army to Sicily, where he hoped to incite a slave rebellion on the grain-rich island. However, the pirates betrayed him, taking his payment but providing no ships. Trapped in the tow of Italy by Crassus's forces, Spartacus faced the prospect of a final battle. His army had shrunk to about 60,000 people, many of them non-combatants. The Romans had built a wall across the peninsula, cutting off any chance of escape. Winter was approaching, and supplies were running low. The situation was desperate, but Spartacus refused to surrender. In the spring of 71 BCE, knowing that delay would only weaken his position, Spartacus made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than attempt to break through the Roman lines, he would seek out Crassus himself for single combat. He understood that his rebellion was doomed, but he could ensure that his death would be that of a warrior, not a slave. The final battle took place in the mountains of southern Italy. Spartacus, mounted on his war horse and wearing captured Roman armor, led his remaining forces in a desperate charge against Crassus's legions. According to Roman historians, he fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, cutting down Roman soldiers as he pressed toward Crassus's position. The battle was fierce and bloody. Spartacus's men, knowing this was their last stand, fought with the desperation of the doomed. They had tasted freedom and would rather die than return to slavery. The gladiator turned general was struck down in the thick of the fighting, his body so mutilated that it was never identified among the thousands of corpses. The aftermath of the rebellion was as brutal as the fighting itself. Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 surviving rebels along the Appian Way, the road between Rome and Capua. For miles, the crosses lined the road, serving as a grim reminder of the price of rebellion against Roman authority. The message was clear. This was the fate of all who dared to challenge the power of Rome. Yet Spartacus's rebellion had profound effects that extended far beyond his death. It exposed the fundamental instability of a society built on slavery and showed that even the most oppressed people could organize effective resistance. The rebellion forced Rome to reconsider its treatment of slaves and gladiators, leading to some improvements in conditions, though slavery itself remained integral to Roman society. More importantly, Spartacus became a symbol of resistance against oppression that would inspire people for centuries to come. His story demonstrated that ordinary people, no matter how powerless they might seem, could challenge the most powerful systems of their time. The gladiator who refused to die for someone else's entertainment chose instead to live and die for his own freedom and that of his people. The rebellion also revealed the military and political talents of its leader. Spartacus had transformed from a provincial warrior into a general who could outmaneuver Roman commanders and create a functioning society out of escaped slaves. His tactical innovations, particularly his use of guerrilla warfare and his ability to integrate diverse populations into an effective fighting force, would influence military thinking for generations. In the end, Spartacus achieved a kind of immortality that few Roman generals could claim. While Crassus won the battle, Spartacus won the war for historical memory. His name became synonymous with the struggle for freedom and human dignity, inspiring everyone from the American revolutionaries to modern civil rights leaders. The gladiator who fought for his life in the arena ultimately fought for something far greater, the idea that all people deserve to be free. The smoke from burning villages darkened the sky over the French countryside as a teenage peasant girl knelt in prayer before the village church of Domremy. It was 1428, and France was dying. The English had conquered most of the northern territories. The rightful king remained uncrowned, and French nobles fought among themselves while their people suffered. In this moment of national desperation, 17-year-old Joan of Arc heard voices that would change the course of European history. Born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy, in the Duchy of Bar, Joan was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc, a prosperous peasant farmer, and Isabel Romy. Her childhood was marked by the constant threat of war. English and Burgundian forces regularly raided the countryside, forcing villagers to flee to fortified towns for protection. The 100 Years' War had been raging for nearly a century, and France seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Joan's early life was typical of a medieval peasant girl. She helped with farming, learned to spin and sew, and received religious instruction from the local priest. She was described as unusually pious, often kneeling in prayer in the village church, and showing deep devotion to the Virgin Mary and the saints. What set her apart was her passionate love for France and her profound distress at seeing her country torn apart by foreign invaders and civil war. The political situation in France was dire. King Charles VI had died in 1422, leaving the throne disputed between his son, the Dauphin Charles VII, and the infant Henry VI of England, whose claim came through his mother, a French princess. The English, allied with the powerful Burgundians, controlled Paris and most of northern France. The Dauphin controlled only the central and southern regions, and his legitimacy was questioned by many of his own nobles. In 1425, when Joan was about 13, she experienced the first of her mystical visions. She later testified that the Archangel Michael, along with Saints Margaret and Catherine, appeared to her in her father's garden. The saints told her that she had been chosen by God to save France and ensure the Dauphin's coronation as the rightful king. At first, Joan was overwhelmed by the magnitude of this calling. She was an illiterate peasant girl in a world where women had no political power and peasants were expected to obey their social superiors without question. For 3 years, Joan kept her visions secret, continuing her daily life while the voices grew more insistent. They told her that she must go to the Dauphin's court, convince him to give her an army, and lift the English siege of Orleans. the key city whose fall would open the path to complete English victory. The voices also revealed that she would be wounded in battle but would ultimately succeed in her mission to crown the Dauphin in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French royal coronations. The turning point came in 1428, when the English began their siege of Orleans. This city was crucial to French resistance. If it fell, the English would control the Loire River and have a clear path to the Dauphin's remaining territories. Joan knew that her time had come. She convinced her uncle, Durand Blacksart, to take her to Robert de Baudricourt, the military governor of the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. Baudricourt's initial reaction was predictable. He dismissed Joan as a delusional peasant girl and told her uncle to take her home and arrange a marriage for her. But Joan was persistent. She returned to Vaucouleurs repeatedly, gaining support from some of the townspeople and soldiers who were impressed by her knowledge of recent military defeats that had not yet been announced publicly. She claimed this information came from her voices, and gradually, people began to believe that she might indeed be divinely inspired. Joan's persistence finally paid off when she made a startling prediction. She told Baudricourt that the Dauphin's forces would suffer a terrible defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, known as the Battle of the Herrings. When news of this defeat reached Vaucouleurs days later, exactly as Joan had predicted, Baudricourt was convinced. He provided her with a small escort and a letter of introduction to the Dauphin. The journey to the Dauphin's court at Chinon was perilous. Joan had to travel through enemy territory, disguised as a man for protection. She wore men's clothing and cut her hair short, a scandalous act for a woman of her time. This choice of masculine dress would later be used against her by her enemies, but Joan insisted it was necessary for her mission, and had been approved by her heavenly voices. When Joan arrived at Chinon in March 1429, she faced the greatest challenge of her young life, convincing the Dauphin and his court that she was genuine. The court was filled with sophisticated nobles, churchmen, and advisors who were deeply skeptical of peasant claims to divine inspiration. The Dauphin himself was weak-willed and surrounded by counselors who often gave conflicting advice. Joan's first meeting with the Dauphin became the stuff of legend. According to contemporary accounts, Charles tried to test her by hiding in the crowd of courtiers while another man sat on the throne. Joan immediately identified the real Dauphin and knelt before him, declaring, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." She then spoke to him privately, revealing details about his secret prayers and doubts about his legitimacy that convinced him of her divine calling. The court remained skeptical, so Joan was subjected to extensive questioning by theologians and church officials. For weeks, she was interrogated about her visions, her religious beliefs, and her mission. The scholars were looking for any sign of heresy or deception. Joan's responses were remarkable for their consistency and theological sophistication, despite her lack of formal education. She maintained that her voices came from God, and that her mission was to save France and ensure the Dauphin's coronation. Finally, after 3 weeks of examination, the theologians concluded that Joan showed no signs of heresy, and that her mission might indeed be divinely inspired. The Dauphin, desperate for any hope of victory, decided to trust her. He provided Joan with a small armor, and a sword that she claimed had been revealed to her by her voices, found buried behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine in Fierbois. Joan's transformation from peasant girl to military leader was remarkable. She adopted the title the Maid, and had a banner made showing Christ in glory with the names of Jesus and Mary. She insisted on strict discipline among her troops, banning swearing, looting, and the presence of prostitutes in the camp. Her soldiers, initially skeptical, were gradually won over by her courage, conviction, and apparent military intuition. The siege of Orleans had been ongoing for months when Joan arrived in April 1429. The city was nearly starved into submission, and French morale was at its lowest point. The English had built a series of fortifications around the city. effectively cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. Previous attempts to break the siege had failed, and many believed that Orleans would soon fall. Joan's arrival electrified the French forces. She sent a letter to the English commanders, demanding that they abandon the siege and return to England. The letter was boldly signed Jesus Maria, and declared that she was sent by God to drive the English from France. The English response was to threaten to burn her as a witch if she fell into their hands. The assault on the English fortifications began on May 4, 1429. Joan led her troops in a series of coordinated attacks on the English strongholds surrounding the city. Her presence on the battlefield was inspiring. She carried her banner instead of a weapon, encouraging her soldiers while appearing to be divinely protected from enemy fire. On May 7th, during the assault on the fortress of Lesterels, Joan was wounded by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. True to her visions, she was injured but not killed. Despite her wound, Joan returned to the battle and led the final assault that captured Lesterels. The sight of their supposedly invincible fortress falling to a peasant girl's army broke English morale. The next morning, the English abandoned their remaining positions and lifted the siege. Orleans was saved, and Joan's reputation as a divinely inspired leader was established. The victory at Orleans was just the beginning of Joan's remarkable military campaign. Over the following months, she led French forces to a series of victories that cleared the English from the Loire Valley. Towns that had been under English control for years surrendered at the mere approach of Joan's army. The psychological impact of her victories was as important as the military results. The French people began to believe that God was on their side and that ultimate victory was possible. Joan's greatest triumph came on July 17, 1429, when she stood beside the Dauphin in Reims Cathedral as he was crowned Charles VII, King of France. The ceremony was attended by nobles from across the kingdom, many of whom had previously questioned Charles's legitimacy. Joan's mission, as revealed by her voices, was complete. She had saved Orleans, cleared the English from the Loire, and ensured the coronation of the rightful king. However, Joan's success also made her enemies. The English and their Burgundian allies were desperate to capture her, believing that her death would restore their fortunes. Some French nobles were also uncomfortable with the influence of a peasant girl who claimed direct communication with God. The medieval world was rigidly hierarchical, and Joan's rise challenged fundamental assumptions about social order and divine authority. The beginning of Joan's downfall came when she attempted to capture Paris in September 1429. The assault failed, and Joan was wounded again, this time in the thigh. The failure at Paris showed that she was not invincible, and some of her support began to waver. King Charles VII, now crowned and recognized, seemed less interested in aggressive military campaigns and more focused on diplomatic solutions. Joan's capture came on May 23, 1430, during a skirmish at Compiègne. She was pulled from her horse by Burgundian soldiers and sold to the English for 10,000 francs. The English were overjoyed to have her in their custody, but they faced a problem. They couldn't simply execute her for military victories. Instead, they needed to destroy her reputation and discredit her claim to divine inspiration. The solution was to put Joan on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The English arranged for a church court, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a French cleric who supported the English cause. The trial was a mockery of justice from the beginning. Joan was denied legal counsel, questioned repeatedly about theological matters beyond her education, and subjected to threats and psychological pressure. The trial lasted for months, with Joan showing remarkable courage and intelligence in her responses. She consistently maintained that her voices came from God and that her mission was righteous. When asked if she was in God's grace, she gave a response that impressed even her enemies. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The court focused particularly on Joan's wearing of men's clothing. which they claimed was contrary to divine law. Joan explained that she wore men's clothes for protection, and because her voices had told her to do so. She also pointed out that she had resumed women's clothing when in prison, showing that her choice was practical rather than heretical. On May 24, 1431, faced with the threat of immediate execution, Joan signed a confession admitting to various charges. However, she quickly recanted, declaring that she would rather die than deny her voices. This recantation sealed her fate. On May 30, 1431, 19-year-old Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. Her last words were reported to be "Jesus," repeated multiple times as the flames consumed her. The English expected that Joan's death would end French resistance and restore their fortunes. Instead, the opposite happened. Joan became a martyr whose memory inspired continued French resistance. The war continued for another 22 years, but the French gradually drove the English from all their continental possessions except Calais. 25 years after her death, Joan's family petitioned for a new trial to clear her name. The retrial examined the evidence from the original trial and concluded that Joan had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. The court declared her innocent of all charges and proclaimed her a martyr. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc as a saint, recognizing her as a model of faith and courage. Joan's impact on French history cannot be overstated. She transformed a losing war into eventual victory, established the legitimacy of Charles VII, and created a sense of French national identity that would endure for centuries. Her story challenged medieval assumptions about gender, social class, and divine authority, showing that God could work through the most unlikely instruments. More broadly, Joan of Arc became a symbol of resistance against foreign occupation and the power of faith to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Her story has inspired countless others who faced overwhelming odds, from French resistance fighters during World War II to modern civil rights activists. The peasant girl who heard voices in a village church became one of history's most enduring symbols of courage, faith, and the power of conviction to change the world. The Missouri River stretched endlessly before them, its muddy waters carrying the hopes and fears of a young nation toward an unknown destiny. On May 14, 1804, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark stood at the bow of their keelboat, watching the wilderness of the American West unfold before their eyes. Behind them lay the familiar world of the eastern United States. Ahead lay 2,000,000 square miles of largely unmapped territory that would either make or break their expedition, and quite possibly the future of their country. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had doubled the size of the United States overnight. President Thomas Jefferson had acquired this vast territory from France for $15 million, but he faced a problem. No one really knew what America had bought. The land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, but beyond basic geography, it remained a mystery. Jefferson needed to know what resources existed, what peoples lived there, and most importantly, whether there might be a water route to the Pacific Ocean that could revolutionize American trade. Meriwether Lewis was Jefferson's natural choice to lead this expedition. Born in 1774 in Virginia, Lewis had grown up on the frontier and possessed the outdoor skills necessary for wilderness exploration. He had served as Jefferson's personal secretary and had been preparing for this mission for years, studying botany, astronomy, and medicine. Lewis was intelligent, determined, and passionately committed to the success of the expedition, but he also recognized that he would need a partner with complementary skills. William Clark, born in 1770, was Lewis's choice for co-leader. Clark was a skilled mapmaker, an experienced Indian fighter, and a natural leader of men. He had served with distinction in the military campaigns against Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory and possessed the practical experience that would be crucial for managing a large expedition through hostile territory. The partnership between Lewis and Clark would prove to be one of the most successful collaborations in American history. The expedition, officially called the Corps of Discovery, consisted of about 45 men, including soldiers, frontiersmen, interpreters, and Clark's enslaved companion York, whose presence would prove surprisingly important in relations with Native American tribes. The group was carefully selected for specific skills. They included hunters, boat builders, blacksmiths, and men experienced in dealing with hostile environments. Each member understood that they were embarking on a journey from which they might never return. The expedition's scientific goals were as important as its geographical ones. Jefferson instructed Lewis and Clark to document everything they encountered: plants, animals, geological formations, climate, and natural resources. They were to collect specimens, make detailed notes, and create maps that would guide future exploration and settlement. The expedition carried scientific instruments, including a chronometer, sextant, and barometer, as well as supplies for preserving botanical and zoological specimens. The diplomatic aspects of the mission were equally crucial. Lewis and Clark were instructed to establish peaceful relations with Native American tribes, inform them of American sovereignty over the territory, and lay the groundwork for future trade relationships. They carried gifts, medals, and certificates to distribute to tribal leaders, along with a message of friendship from the Great Father in Washington. The journey began at Camp Du Bois, near present-day St. Louis, Missouri. The expedition spent the winter of 1803 to 1800 for training and preparing for the challenges ahead. Lewis and Clark drilled their men in military discipline, studied maps and reports from previous explorers, and gathered intelligence about the territories they would traverse. They knew that success would depend on careful preparation, strict discipline, and the ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. The first phase of the journey took them up the Missouri River through what is now Missouri and Kansas. The river was treacherous, filled with snags, sandbars, and strong currents that constantly threatened to destroy their boats. Progress was slow and exhausting. On good days, they might make 15 miles. On bad days, they might lose ground. The men had to pole, paddle, and sometimes physically drag their boats upstream while dealing with insects, extreme weather, and the constant threat of accidents. Their first major encounter with Native Americans came in August 1804, when they met with representatives of the Oto and Missouri tribes. The meeting established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the expedition: formal speeches, exchange of gifts, and attempts to establish friendly relations. Clark's enslaved companion York attracted particular attention from the tribes, many of whom had never seen a black person before. His presence often helped break the ice and facilitate communication. The expedition's most crucial encounter came in October 1804, when they reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in present-day North Dakota. Winter was approaching, and the expedition needed a place to establish their base camp. The Mandan villages were a major trading center on the northern plains, and the tribes were accustomed to dealing with European traders. Lewis and Clark decided to build Fort Mandan nearby and spend the winter learning about the western territories from the tribe's extensive knowledge. It was at Fort Mandan that the expedition acquired its most famous member, Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who had been captured by the Hidatsa and later married to a French-Canadian trader named Saint Charbonneau. Both Charbonneau and Sacagawea were hired as interpreters, but Sacagawea's knowledge of the western territories and her potential connections to the Shoshone tribe made her invaluable to the expedition. A success. The winter at Fort Mandan was harsh but productive. Temperatures dropped as low as 45 degrees below zero, but the expedition members used the time to repair equipment, study their maps, and gather intelligence about the route ahead. They learned that the Rocky Mountains were far more extensive than previously believed, and that finding a water route to the Pacific would be much more difficult than Jefferson had hoped. On April 7, 1805, the expedition resumed their journey, now reduced to about 33 members. They sent the keelboat back to St. Louis with specimens, maps, and reports for President Jefferson, while the remaining members continued westward in smaller boats. As they entered the territory of present-day Montana, they encountered increasingly difficult rapids and began to see the peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The expedition's encounter with a grizzly bear in late April 1805 demonstrated the dangers they faced in the wilderness. Lewis wrote in his journal about the enormous and terrible beast that required multiple shots to kill. The grizzly bears of the northern plains were larger and more aggressive than the black bears familiar to the expedition members, and several encounters with these massive predators reminded them of their vulnerability in the wilderness. One of the expedition's most challenging moments came at the Great Falls of the Missouri River in June 1805. The falls were a spectacular natural wonder, but they represented a major obstacle to the expedition's progress. The boats could not navigate the falls, so the expedition had to portage around them, a back-breaking process that took nearly a month. The men had to carry their boats and supplies 18 miles around the falls on improvised wheels, dealing with prickly pear cactus, rattlesnakes, and constant physical exhaustion. As the expedition pushed deeper into the mountains, they faced their greatest challenge, finding the Shoshone tribe and obtaining horses for the mountain crossing. Without horses, they could not continue their journey, and without Shoshone guides, they might become lost in the maze of mountain valleys. The pressure was enormous. Winter was approaching, and they had to cross the Continental Divide before snow made travel impossible. The reunion between Sacagawea and her brother Camoed, now a Shoshone chief, was one of the expedition's most emotional moments. Sacagawea had been captured as a child and never expected to see her family again. This emotional reunion helped cement the alliance between the expedition and the Shoshone tribe, leading to the horses and guides they desperately needed. The crossing of the Rocky Mountains was the expedition's greatest ordeal. Following Shoshone guides along the Lolo Trail, they struggled through dense forests, over treacherous mountain passes, and across swollen streams. Food was scarce, and the men were reduced to eating candles and their own horses. Snow fell early, and several expedition members became ill. For 11 days, they fought their way through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. The expedition's emergence from the mountains and their encounter with the Nez Perce tribe marked a turning point in their journey. The Nez Perce, led by Chief Twisted Hair, welcomed the expedition and helped them build canoes for the next phase of their journey. The tribe's hospitality probably saved the expedition from starvation and allowed them to continue toward the Pacific. The final phase of the journey took them down the Columbia River system toward the Pacific Ocean. The river was dangerous, filled with rapids and waterfalls, but it offered the promise of reaching their ultimate destination. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote in his journal the famous words, "Ocean in view, the joy." Though they were actually seeing the Columbia River estuary, the Pacific Ocean was finally within reach. The expedition built Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon, and spent the winter of 1805 to 1806 on the Pacific coast. The winter was miserable, it rained constantly, food was scarce, and the men were homesick and eager to return east. However, they used the time productively, documenting the plants and animals of the Pacific Northwest, trading with local tribes, and preparing for the return journey. The return journey began on March 23, 1806, and proved to be faster but no less dangerous than the outbound trip. The expedition split into two groups to explore different routes, with Lewis leading one party north to explore the Marias River and Clark leading another south to explore the Yellowstone River. This division of forces was risky, but it allowed them to gather more geographical information about the northern territories. Lewis's detour to the Marias River nearly ended in disaster when his party encountered a group of Blackfeet warriors. The confrontation resulted in the death of two Blackfeet men, the only violence between the expedition and Native Americans during the entire journey. Lewis's party had to flee rapidly to avoid retaliation, riding over 100 miles in 24 hours to reach safety. The expedition reunited at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers in August 1806, and their journey downstream was swift and joyful. They had survived their incredible adventure and were returning home with a wealth of scientific and geographical knowledge. On September 23, 1806, they reached St. Louis, where they were greeted as heroes by crowds of people who had assumed they were dead. The Lewis and Clark expedition had traveled approximately 8,000 miles over 28 months, mapping vast territories, documenting hundreds of plant and animal species, and establishing relationships with numerous Native American tribes. They had proven that no easy water route to the Pacific existed, but they had also demonstrated that overland travel to the Pacific was possible, and had identified the potential for American expansion across the continent. The expedition's scientific contributions were enormous. They documented 178 plants and 122 animals previously unknown to science, including prairie dogs, grizzly bears, and mountain goats. Their detailed maps and journals provided the first accurate description of the Western Territories and became the foundation for all future exploration and settlement. The specimens they collected filled museums and advanced scientific understanding of American biodiversity. The diplomatic aspects of the expedition were equally important. Lewis and Clark had established contact with dozens of Native American tribes, creating relationships that would influence American policy for decades. Their detailed ethnographic observations provided valuable insights into Native American cultures and helped shape government policies toward Western tribes. The expedition's impact on American expansion was profound. Their reports sparked the imagination of thousands of Americans and contributed to the growing belief in manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to expand from coast to coast. The Oregon Trail, the California Gold Rush, and the eventual settlement of the American West all built upon the foundation laid by Lewis and Clark. The personal costs of the expedition were significant. Lewis struggled with depression and alcoholism after his return and died under mysterious circumstances in 1809, possibly by suicide. Clark went on to have a successful career as superintendent of Indian Affairs and territorial governor, but he never forgot his friend and partner. Sacagawea's later life remains largely unknown, though she became a symbol of the contributions of Native American women to American exploration. The expedition also had tragic consequences for Native American tribes. The detailed information Lewis and Clark provided about Western territories and resources accelerated American expansion and the displacement of indigenous peoples. The very success of their peaceful relations with most tribes they encountered made their territories seem safe and accessible to future settlers, contributing to the eventual conquest and marginalization of Native American peoples. Despite these complex legacies, the Lewis and Clark expedition remains one of the greatest achievements in American exploration. It demonstrated the power of careful planning, scientific inquiry, and diplomatic skill in overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The expedition opened the American West to the world and established the United States as a continental power. The courage, determination, and leadership of Lewis and Clark, supported by the entire Corps of Discovery, transformed a young nation's understanding of its own potential and set the stage for the dramatic expansion that would define the 19th century. Their journey from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean and back again was more than a geographical expedition. It was a voyage of discovery that revealed the true scope and potential of the American continent. In an age when the Western territories were as unknown as the surface of the moon, Lewis and Clark provided the map and the inspiration for a nation to fulfill its continental destiny. These three remarkable figures Spartacus, Joan of Arc, and Lewis and Clark lived in different centuries and faced vastly different challenges. Yet their stories share common threads that illuminate the human capacity for greatness. Each confronted seemingly impossible odds with courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in their cause. Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator, transformed from entertainment for Roman crowds into a symbol of resistance against oppression. His rebellion may have failed militarily, but it succeeded in demonstrating that even the most powerless individuals could challenge the mightiest empires. His legacy reminds us that the desire for freedom is universal, and that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, showed that divine inspiration and personal conviction could overcome the barriers of gender, class, and political impossibility. Her transformation from village girl to national savior illustrates the power of faith and determination to change the course of history. Her story continues to inspire those who face overwhelming odds with nothing but their belief in a righteous cause. Lewis and Clark, the American explorers, demonstrated that careful planning, scientific inquiry, and diplomatic skill could overcome the challenges of unknown territories and hostile environments. Their expedition opened a continent to exploration and settlement, showing how collaboration, preparation, and adaptability could achieve goals that seemed impossible to previous generations. What unites these three stories is their illustration of human potential. Each protagonist faced circumstances that would have defeated lesser individuals, yet they persevered through courage, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to their goals. They remind us that history is shaped not by inevitable forces but by the choices and actions of remarkable individuals who refuse to accept the limitations of their time. These stories also demonstrate the complex relationship between individual achievement and historical consequences. Spartacus's rebellion ultimately failed, but it inspired future generations fighting for freedom. Joan of Arc saved France, but paid with her life, becoming a martyr whose memory outlasted her persecutors. Lewis and Clark opened the American West, but their success contributed to the displacement of Native American peoples. History is rarely simple, and great achievements often come with unintended consequences. As we reflect on these three tales, we're reminded that every generation faces challenges that seem insurmountable. Whether it's fighting against oppression, defending one's country, or exploring unknown territories, the human spirit has consistently found ways to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The courage of Spartacus, the faith of Joan of Arc, and the determination of Lewis and Clark continue to inspire us to push beyond our perceived limitations and strive for greatness. What stories from history inspire you the most? Have you ever faced a challenge that seemed impossible until you found the courage to confront it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from history that show the amazing things humans can achieve when they refuse to give up on their drive. Eames. History is not just about the past, it's about understanding the potential that exists within each of us to change the world.